So as I said, we have two presenters tonight from the Department of Transport. Caoimhín is Assistant Secretary for Climate Action at the Department of Transport. He recently took over a new role as Head of Climate Action at the Department of Transport with responsibility for development, coordination, delivery and engagement of climate action within the department. He has over 10 years experience at head of function level across many areas of transport policy and delivery, as well as corporate support, EU and international relations within the department. Andrea is Head of Energy, Air and Adaptation in the Climate Unit of the Department of Transport. The Climate Unit coordinates the department's policy response to the challenge of climate change. This includes delivery on the ambition of the Climate Action Plan concerning the transport sector. Andrea has responsibility for the renewable fuel policy, adoption and air quality matters relating to the transport sector, and leads on the Department of Transport climate research across the theme of sustainability and climate action. So again, before I head over, I hand you over now to Ciaruáin and Andrea.
Hi, and thank you very much, Dennis, and good evening, everybody. Yeah, as Dennis has said, my name is Caoimhín O Ciaruáin. Just recently, in the last week and a half, took over of the position of Head of Climate Action in the Department of Transport. And I'm accompanied here today by Andrea Lennon. We're going to share time here, myself and Andrea. Just I'm going to talk through in kind of general terms around what the overall challenge here, what the big picture is for decarbonisation and specifically around the transport piece, and then looking to the climate action plan and the various measures that we're undertaking within the Department of Transport and within the wider transport sector to kind of to address the many challenges that exist in relation to this space and the overall transition. Andrea will then kind of talk to her areas of expertise around renewables, research and adaptation, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end then to do some to take some questions. And obviously you will have our email, I think, available. So for any kind of questions that you can't answer or you don't get time to address, you can send them on to us. And this, I suppose, is part of our role in the department, is about engaging with the widest kind of possible stakeholder set and in transport. There are many and varied stakeholders in this space, and clearly engineers are critical to all of this, and I'll talk a bit to that later on, but you're a critical kind of stakeholder in finding solutions to big and small problems, and this one doesn't come any bigger. Okay, so just a quick overview of the presentation this evening. Why, I think part of the question why around what we're doing here doesn't actually need to be answered, right? But I'm going to give you some sense of the kind of context and the commitments that are there. But it's actually one of the things when you have conversations with your kids and otherwise, the why bit around this doesn't really feature. You don't really have to explain why you get up in the morning and do this job. It has to be done. The what, in terms of what we're about and what's expected of us and what the commitments are there. We'll talk a little bit in terms of the scale of the challenge, the scale of the problem, both nationally and sectoral level in transport. Then a little bit around how we get there in terms of the pathway to decarbonisation as we've set it out in the Climate Action Plan. And this is an iterative process, so it continues to be updated as technology and as experience dictates how some of these measures land. And then just a bit more detail in terms of the specific areas of action for transport as set out in the Climate Action Plan and elsewhere. What our immediate challenges are, and I suppose this decade is seen as the critical decade in actually addressing, mobilising and getting this right. And even within this decade, there are a number of, the first number of years here are absolutely critical. So set out some of the immediate challenges. Then just over the next year, there are some key milestones ahead for us in transport, just to give you some sense of what they are, what we need to be hitting. And then I suppose one of the issues is, and as in any kind of public service and any engagement that we do, there is quite a lot of an apparatus around the reporting and the governance arrangements around this. And it's absolutely critical in this space. Who is actually making sure we do what we're supposed to be doing here, and how is that managed? So a bit on that. And then just the final slide there for me will be around just what Engineering Ireland and what engineers in general I think can bring. And I'm sure most of you probably are engaged in some way or another already in the space. And I think there is an opportunity maybe to engage in a kind of wider conversation around this through yourselves. And then I'll pass over to Andrea just to talk through her areas and say that it's mainly around the adaptation and renewables, and also a little bit on research and the research piece that we're engaged in. Okay, big picture, I suppose the why we're doing this, and I suppose we have committed internationally and nationally to delivering by 2030 51%, well, ranging between 51 and 55% emissions reduction and net zero by 2050. And here you have various organs at international level, the UN, FCC, and the Paris Agreement, and then you have at European level a very ambitious commitment through the EU Green Deal, and more recently Fit for 55, which is a kind of package of proposals that emerged over the summer last year, setting out how we achieve across various sectors that level of commitment at a European level, and Europe wants to be in the lead in this. And nationally, and I believe we are second only to Denmark in terms of the level of commitment that we have in relation to climate action. And we have a programme for government commitment. We have a Climate Act, which legally binds us to delivering 51% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And published last November, we have the latest iteration of the Climate Action Plan, which represents a significant ramping up of our expectation in relation to that, and consistent with both the Programme for Government and the Climate Act itself. So all of these legislative and non-legislative initiatives are about delivering that ultimate objective set out there. What's new in the Climate Act 2021, it has a much longer name, we're just going to use the Climate Act 2021, is that this is now legally binding on us at a national level, at a government level, at a sectoral level, at a ministerial level. So you have a much more stronger commitment on all of us to deliver this, and there ain't no getting away from it. Okay, just moving on then, I suppose just a little bit on the Climate Action Plan itself, and this was published back in November 2021 after a lot of deliberation, and because it was ramping up in line with the Programme for Government and the Climate Act itself. There was a lot of deliberation, a lot of consultation, a lot of citizen engagement around it, a lot of modelling and research done to support it. And it's quite, as you can see, quite an accessible document. I have it as my backdrop permanently now. And some people call it kind of a Teletubbies world, but I'm quite happy to have it behind me. Just to kind of, it's quite an accessible document, but it sets out in very kind of granular terms actually how we will achieve our ambitions here at a national level across each sector, and then it breaks it down in terms of public sector and other elements of what needs to be delivered. What you see there is, I've just given a kind of quick overview of the range of emission targets in it per sector. So you see that obviously electricity is seen to be one of the, and it's quite advanced at this point. The level of ambition there is extremely high. Buildings equally, transport as the second biggest emitter. We have a range of emission target built in there between 42 and agriculture being the biggest emitting, has 22 to 30% level of emission ambition. All of those add up to a 51% reduction at their highest range. So there's an expectation that those ranges will be managed, and there's quite a science to all of that, which I won't get into now. But so that's the Climate Action Plan itself. Just in terms of process, and I suppose give you some sense of the national picture here. Just bear with me a sec. Yeah, so within that you have the various stepped carbon budgets which have been recommended now by the Climate Advisory Council. And I just might be just useful to set the scene in relation to that. We have, and this is part of the apparatus around the Climate Act itself, that the Climate Advisory Council would recommend carbon budgets over the next series of 5-year cycles. So up to 2025, the recommendation there is an annual reduction of 4.8%. From 25 to 26 to 30, it's increasing to 8.3%, and that red dot represents the 51% reduction that's expected. So there's a trajectory there which builds in a fairly ambitious at 4.8% reduction in the first number of years, but building up to 8.3% over the following 5 years. And then the third 5-year cycle represents the trajectory to 2050. So that's what Climate Advisory Council have recommended, again, based on significant modelling and research and review of what is possible. And then that is now being published. It's with the Oireachtas, it's with government departments and ministers now to consider, how to react to those recommendations. Are they appropriate? Are they ambitious enough? Are they achievable? All those kind of questions arise. So the Climate Act itself requires that the carbon budgets to be settled by the end of February, anyway, the 25th of February. So there's a lot of work underway in relation to that, and there's a lot of discussion, and it's the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate has been very active in relation to this over the last number of weeks. And you probably have seen some of the coverage in relation to that. So there is quite a deal of debate around the budgetary process itself. These then, once they're agreed, will be translated into sectoral targets. And that's where it gets particularly interesting, because you're in a zero-sum game, and there between different sectors, how those budgets will be divvied up across the different sectors. So that is something that government will deliberate on, and we'll be at departmental and official level very much engaged in that process over the forthcoming months. And then we will go into another iteration of the Climate Action Plan itself, which will then will move from those ranges of emission targets then to more specific, more precise ceilings per sector, all of which will have to add up to a 51% delivery by 2030. So hopefully that's given you some flavour of what the national challenge is. So moving quickly to the transport challenge. And here, again, this hopefully illustrates quite starkly the level of challenge here. And these are 2018 is the baseline here. So business as usual projections. And this is the big issue for transport, is that you are building in level of population and economic and employment growth over those intervening years, which on a business as usual basis brings us to between 13 and 15 megatons, right? So to deliver a 51% cut on a 12 megaton thing, it's 6 megatons, but you're actually, you're going to have to deliver a lot more in those intervening years than that to achieve that level of abatement. It's a big challenge. Transport obviously is critical here because it represents 18% of emissions based on the last EPA inventory. Half of that relates to car usage. It's mainly an issue of travel behavior, which has been embedded for decades, and we bake it into how we live and where we live. We have a high level of car dependency. We have not the most competitive alternatives in many areas in terms of sustainable modes. So all of this points to a radical systemic change being required. How we travel, how we move goods, how we move ourselves. There's a significant cost here in that transition, and a key element in our thinking and throughout the climate action plan itself is around the a just transition, a fair and equitable distribution of that cost. I think the figure for transport is around 51 billion based on the McKinsey analysis. A lot of that is in the private area in terms of technology adoption. So it's quite a significant cost. And even in terms of the COVID experience, as we emerge from it in 2020, with all the travel restrictions that were there, we only achieved a 17% reduction. So that gives you some sense of the kind of level of transformation that will be required here. Okay. The good news is that we do have a pathway. As I said, in the Climate Action Plan, we've kind of set out a series of measures, again, which have been modeled and researched, and that they represent a high level of ambition here, right? So, and we get to 43% by 2030 based on the actions that are set out in the Climate Action Plan. And again, a lot of the attention goes to the EVs element of this, the electric vehicles. So the ambition is to achieve 100% new car sales within that time frame. And it's on a kind of a slow but exponential trajectory to get there. There's other, so all of the actions here are based on this kind of paradigm of avoid, shift, improve. I think many will be familiar with it. So the first thing here is actually to reduce demand, to actually get people out of their car, to reduce the amount of kilometers they spend in their fossil fueled cars. So that's in the demand management piece. Then once you're out of your car, what are you going to do? How are you going to get to work? How are you going to get to the shops? So we're looking at, and this has started clearly, the investment in public transport and in active travel being key elements of that. And then the more invisible element of the solution is around biofuel blending, and Andrea will talk to that later. But that's actually quite a significant win or significant potential within that already. And then you have the last step in that kind of avoid, shift, improve piece is looking at the technology that we're using and improving how that technology works. So there you have your EV piece in that. It tends to be the one that gets the most publicity, but and will deliver, but it's not the only thing we're doing. Just here, I've kind of set out in a bit more detail the various strands of what's in the Climate Action Plan. So demand management is that kind of piece of, is there another way to get to work? Another way to get to leave your car behind? The target, the metric that's been set is to reduce ICE kilometers, as in internal combustion engine car kilometers, by at least 10% by 2030. There's a fair bit of work, and I'll get into some of the detail around that later. In relation to demand management, we've published 2 studies recently looking at 5 cities and how the 5 cities, what kind of menu of options are available to deliver that reduction in ICE kilometers. And it's not going to be easy. It's probably the most difficult end of the spectrum in terms of delivery, but it's necessary and it will be done. Sustainable mobility is obviously looking at developing the alternatives and offering attractive, reliable ways of traveling. commuting, and the target there is 500,000 extra sustainable trips daily by 2030. So that will require a significant ramping up of public transport investment, of active travel, and that's already happening. But there's a lot more to be done there. Electrification, as I mentioned already, target there is to reach that 945 zero emission vehicles by 2030. And we have quite a number of interventions already in place to bring us along that trajectory. They are working. There is a significant take up already in EVs, and there's a lot of good strategic thinking around how we look to continue to incentivize that take up. And also then obviously the electrification extends beyond the car. It's into light vehicles and heavy goods vehicles, and also looking at rail as an option, particularly in terms of freight, but also rail in terms of further electrification of the rail network. Biofuels, as I've mentioned already, again, is one of those, the invisible measures, and the intention there is to deliver to E10 and B20 in terms of diesel and petrol blends by 2030, which will deliver quite significant abatement. They're transitionary kind of measures because they work within the existing technology, but they're highly effective. Here are just the metrics that have been set out in the Climate Action Plan. And you can see there it's 2025 to 2030, growth in electrification, etc., has been set out there. In terms of emission savings, the modelling is showing at around a 3.6 megaton saving from the electrification piece. Most of that is through the electrification of passenger cars. And then biofuels is quite significant at 1.1 megaton. Sustainable travel will deliver 1.4, potential to deliver more depending on the pace of the delivery of public transport and active travel. So that's one area where there is scope for more to be delivered. And then hopefully when we come to that shortfall piece, we're 0.9 of a megaton, a gap in terms of reaching the 51% by 2030. So that we're conducting a study currently, or we're to engage in a series of engagements and research around what are the measures here, what other measures are there, and we're not too sure there are a whole lot more measures already than the ones we've identified. When you start calibrating and pressing more buttons in relation to some of these, what are the impacts at a socioeconomic level in terms of particular cohorts and particular sectors by dialing up these measures. So that's a piece of work that is underway to look at the gap to target, as we call it. So what are the immediate challenges? I suppose here, what I would say is that one of the things we really need to do better from a transport perspective, maybe more widely, is to signal the level of ambition. I think part of the debate in this whole area has been, what exactly, and as an expectation, at a citizen level, that there will be action taken. And I think part of our role is actually to ensure that the level of change required here is understood. But we have to start signaling the level of ambition, first of all, and being clear about that. And then building that momentum around the actions that we've set out. Another area is looking to identify, what success looks like. So the kind of pathfinder approach to projects and initiatives. And there are already many out there that can deliver and are delivering and present the vision of what a carbon-free society could look like. So doing more work around showcasing those kind of pathfinder projects, both nationally and internationally, is key. EV rollout, as I mentioned, and we have a number of initiatives there in terms of the establishment of the Office of Low Emission Vehicles and the EV infrastructure strategy, all of which will be in play in the next number of months. And there's an expectation, obviously, here that the public sector will take a lead, particularly in the electrification area, but also in the wider space of procurement, circular economy, etc. So significant expectation there. So all of that is about kind of building and sustaining a momentum towards the target. Stakeholder engagement is going to be a key element, a key immediate challenge as well. And we obviously do this as a matter of course in devising policy, but I think there's a much more intensive level of engagement required now with stakeholders. And stakeholders, by that I mean, I think they're many and varied, but we have systemic issues in terms of planning, making sure that we have sufficient energy in the grid, that taxation measures are sufficient and will distribute the cost in an equitable way. And budget is going to be a key area for us to kind of look. We have NDP funding to deliver on much of the public transport and active travel measures, but there will be significant requirements around budget going forward to deliver on this. The enterprise sector has a key role in all of this, and we need to engage more. We do already, but we need to engage more to get some sight of what are the potential derailers around this, around our level of ambition, but at least that they understand where we want to go, where we want to take this, and that we can engage in a kind of constructive discussion and a partnership with enterprise generally around how we achieve it in transport. The political system is obviously a key stakeholder in all of this, and that work continues. We spent a lot of time in and out of Oireachtas committees lately, explaining what we're about, and I think it's a vital element of, at the very least, ensuring that there's reliable and compelling information around the narrative here, that it is understood what the level of challenge is, but also what the future looks like, and how the citizen and the political system can play its part to making that happen. And the final and probably the most important stakeholder in all of this is the citizen. And this is the big challenge, is bringing citizen with us. We have a lot of research out there currently through the EPA and others telling us that the citizen wants to be part of this, understands what's involved, and wants to participate. So I think in transport we have a particular opportunity to engage the citizen in a way and activate that energy in a way that they can feel they are participating and making a difference and contributing to it. Transport affects everybody's lives in one way or another, and you can make choices now that would actually improve and contribute. So we need to do that in a more structured way, and we do have plans in relation to citizen engagement. We have plans in relation to running communications campaigns over the next year or two around that, to activate the citizen. Just a few milestones ahead, and I see I'm kind of running a little bit late here in my slideshow, so I'll just maybe skip through some of this, but there's some key milestones ahead over the next year. Really, we, as I mentioned, demand management, and we have a number of studies, and we want to kind of bring those home, bring those to local authorities, regional assemblies, and set out what the options are in relation to demand management that will suit the various cities. So that work is there. It just needs to be kind of mobilized and understood and activated. Nifty. Some of you may be aware of this. I hope more of you will become aware of it, but the department has published a new national investment framework for transport in Ireland, which sets out a new dispensation in terms of how we make decision making in relation to transport investment, which effectively prioritizes carbon. That's the key determinant, but there are others, obviously, and there's a hierarchy, and there's a whole lot of good work happening in relation to that. So we can send on details if you haven't seen that, but there's a lot of good thinking has gone into the publication of that framework in the last 18 months, 2 years, but it's now in public domain. Obviously, public transport projects, and many of you will be aware of these: Connecting Ireland, Bus Connects, GDA strategy, All Ireland Strategic Rail Review, DART, plus a lot of fairly significant public transport investment programs are underway, and these will deliver, and particularly Bus Connects will deliver within the decade in ways that will deliver significant carbon abatement, as long as that switch is made. Sustainable mobility policy, that's one that has been in the works for a number, for probably well over a year, 18 months, significant consultation around this. It's probably the first signal, I suppose, in a number of years around what the department and what other kind of agencies in the space are doing. A lot of it is reflected already in the Climate Action Plan, but it's actually a significant piece of work that will be published in the next number of weeks. So keep an eye out for that one. Haulage strategy and the EV infrastructure strategy. I won't go through each of those now, but certainly in terms of, you have the kind of key milestones that are coming up for the Department of Transport in terms of this movement of climate action. Conscious of time, I'll skip through that stuff. The toolkit for demand management. So say that reflects that kind of paradigm of avoid, shift, improve, manage, and we've translated that in those studies into a set of priorities, and that's not there. Set of priorities for each of the 5 cities in terms of what is, potentially the most effective tools to manage that demand for ICE vehicle kilometres into our cities. Nifty. Again, I won't go into a whole lot of detail on that. I will say that it's a framework now that has replaced the strategic investment framework, and has now kind of reset the hierarchy of, in terms of decision making, and establishing a set of priorities that all transport investment must align to if we're to deliver on our carbon and our national planning framework. It's one which, as we're saying here, sectoral strategies will have to align to, and there's a lot of work. And what's clear, I suppose I've been kind of working in this area now for the last number of months, what's clear is there's a lot of activity on the ground, both in terms of kind of metropolitan transport strategies, Greater Dublin area strategies, transport strategies, but there's a lot of activity around this. Each local authority is required to produce a climate action plan. A lot of activity around how we design ourselves to deliver on climate ambition. This is a tool that is very much geared towards helping those kind of decision-making processes within at all levels in terms of transport. So if you haven't seen it, go look for it. It's available on the department's website, and it'll become the kind of go-to document for informing decision making. Okay, just a quick slide on and this is the draft sustainable mobility policy framework. So this is a sneak peek, but there'll be no huge surprises in terms of the principles that are being applied here in the new sustainability policy, around safe and green and people focused versus a car-centric development. I think that's a key element across all of our kind of discussions, is to move away from planning that bakes in the use of the car, and then and then better integrated mobility around accessibility and use of technologies, etc. So I won't get into a huge amount of detail there. That policy is expected to be published within a kind of Q1 time frame for that, and it again will set the template and hopefully the pace of delivery for sustainable transport for the next 5 to 10 years. As I mentioned at the start, like all good things, we have to report and ensure that there's a level of governance around what we do. This climate space is particularly, so demanding is one word, it's particularly exacting in terms of what's required here, because we are now in a legally binding space to deliver on the targets. So I'm not too sure there's anywhere else in terms of government policy that has that level of legally binding requirement on it. and at a ministerial level, at a sectoral level in particular. So there's a lot of expectation around that, and a lot of kind of work is underway to actually deliver on this. And there is obviously the threat of penalties at an EU level if we don't deliver. There's the threat of legal action at a sectoral level if we don't deliver. So all of this is pointed to a level and a pace of delivery that we haven't actually done, and hasn't been seen in any sector, but particularly in terms of transport. So that delivery piece will be key going forward. Nothing in there. I suppose in terms of internally, we are looking ourselves in terms of how we build in and bake in a program with more stronger program management discipline into how we deliver in terms of there's over 70 actions within the climate action plan and transport. So we're about kind of assigning kind of ownerships and developing a risk-based approach to how we deliver. There's a heavy reliance, and I've worked in many areas across the service. And I haven't seen the like of it in terms of the level of research and modelling that has been done to support, and the evidence base to support what we're about, which is reassuring, but it's also an extremely important element in making sure that these actions actually do deliver. You'll see in that slide, there's obviously a lot of different arrangements in place, from cabinet to cabinet committees to a climate delivery board, which is brings the critical secretaries general from key departments together to make sure that delivery is happening. Okay, so just a final slide before I hand over to Andrea. Just, I suppose, in having these type of engagements, I suppose that there is a what do we expect, or what would we like to see from the likes of Engineering Ireland as a kind of critical stakeholder in all of this. And the first thing to say and to acknowledge, obviously, that engineers are basically all over this at every level, at a local authority, at an enterprise level, and at a national and a regional level. And we have quite a number of engineers working within the department and across the agencies. And it's about kind of finding those solutions and innovative solutions and solutions that haven't been kind of thought of before, or making sure that we understand them. So that role for engineers is clearly a big part of what we need to make this happen, to make this work. So just a few call outs. I mean, one thing we are looking for is to identify those kind of pathfinder projects, whether in Ireland or internationally, that actually show what success looks like in this space. And I was at a conference last week, an NTA conference, where again there was quite a number of engineers were present, amongst local authorities, looking at how do we deliver on this active travel vision, and some excellent examples of work that's happening at a very local level, but very, very effective. So that was encouraging, and we need more of that. I suppose as advocates, for systemic change, and we're all working in different areas across the system, nationally, internationally. I suppose we need to have as many advocates on our case and on our side in terms of delivering systemic changes that are required here, and getting the message home, and then identifying and developing innovative solutions, and that's what engineers do. So we want to hear them, and we want to know about them, so we can build them into our own thinking and our own policy solutions. So I think that probably covers it for me, and I'm sorry if I went on a bit long there. It kind of did. So I'll just hand over to Andrea, and I'll continue with the slideshow here. And Andrea, you just tell me when you want me to push on the slides. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caoimhín, and good evening, everyone. I'm just going to follow on from Caoimhín's introduction there and talk about three areas quite briefly. We are running out of time. Renewable fuels is the first, and then adaptation, and then I'll talk a little bit about research as well. So move to the next slide. Caoimhín, can you move to the next slide? Right, thanks very much. There'll be a bit of teamwork here between the two of us, I think. So first of all, just setting out that there are a number of actions in the Climate Action Plan on renewable fuels. The first of these is to set out what is the target for renewable fuels and for the period up to 2030. So that is B20, which is biodiesel in diesel of 20% and ethanol and petrol of 10%. It's currently B7 and E5. The second of the deliverables, I suppose, under the action plan is that we will produce a policy statement on renewable fuels for transport. And we did that in November. We produced a renewable fuel for transport policy. Within that, we have now the third action layer, which is to set out how we're going to support the development of renewable gas, such as biomethane and potentially hydrogen down the road as well. And then fourth action there relates to a study that we're going to carry out this year on the availability and sustainability of bio and renewable fuels. That's particularly honing in on this sustainability issue, which I'll talk about later on. So next slide, please. And as Caoimhín had mentioned, renewable transport fuels are like the invisible mechanism to decarbonise transport. I think in 2020, it says there we had 239 million litres of biofuel displaced by 209 millilitres of fossil fuels. So it's a really important measure as a pathway measure to net zero, and particularly for decarbonisation of hard-to-abate sectors such as the HDB sector. Overall, in 2020, the GHG emissions were 520 kilotons of carbon equivalent. So through mass balance transition, we'll be able to transition to these alternative fuels in all our transport modes potentially. Currently, it's in road transport, but down the line, it will be aviation and maritime as well. The next slide. And just mentioning aviation and maritime, we turn to the European Green Deal and Fit for 55 proposals. So in addition to increasing the overall amount of carbon reduction in the road sector through increased electrification as well, there will also be sub-targets for renewable fuels of non-biological origin and for advanced biofuels. And they will ensure the uptake of innovative renewable fuels. And this should also create a pull effect for renewable fuels for the maritime and aviation sector. There are two proposals in particular in those sectors. In aviation, it's for sustainable aviation fuels. They would be biofuel-based perhaps in the start, but then should move to advanced e-fuels in the future. And the targets there are 2% for 2025, around 5% in 2030, and over 60% by 2050. So that's quite ambitious when we get to 2050 level. Next slide. And just talking about the renewable fuel policy itself that was published in November last year, it does three things. It increases the biofuel obligation, it promotes renewable fuels in development, and it ensures sustainability as well. So it speaks to all those three things. And I'll go into each of those in detail now. Thank you. So on the first point, increasing biofuel obligation, this just sets out a timeline of the trajectory of increase to 2025 and 2030, but also shows how that obligation has increased in the past. So you see it started at a rate of 4% in 2010 and has increased every 2 years by a rate of about 1 or 2% up to 2021. We've increased it this year on the 1st of January by 2% from 11 to 13%. And there will be further increases. You'll see there below in the text, 16% by volume in 2023, 19% in 2022, and 23% in 2025. And by 2030, it will be up to 38% by energy. So whereas this speaks to the percentage of overall blending that has to take place in the renewable fuels that can be met by biodiesel or ethanol, it will increase at a much steeper trajectory than it has done in the past under the Climate Action Plan target. And indeed, we'll have to take into account in the future any changes that happen with regard to the EU Fit for 55 proposal. That would be probably around 2025 onwards, and perhaps any changes in the Climate Action Plan itself with regard to the overall target. So we can move to the next slide. Thanks, Dean. And then on the treatment of development fuels, development renewable fuels, there are a number of these. Green hydrogen is something that's been talked about a lot, particularly, I suppose, to the end of the decade. Biomethane is something that's in existence right now, and we're hoping to increase that in the coming years, and its use in the transport sector. And then there's other fuels, HVO, there's fuels that would be HVO and others used in sustainable aviation, and then at the end, the renewable fuels of non-biological origin. So the policy statement sets out that for all these development fuels, that suppliers will be able to get credits and multiplier credits for these, but they can offset against their biofuel obligation. In order to give effect to those, we will have to do some legislation this year, but the plan is to give effect to them from 1st January 2023. We'll move to the next slide, quickly. And then on sustainability standards, which is the third leg of the stool on the policy statement, the ambition is to increase the level of evaluation and analysis and oversight and enforcement around the blending of renewable and biofuels. So that includes strengthening supervision on the origin feedstocks, enhanced tracking and tracing as a mechanism for reducing fuel fraud. And that speaks to a particular high-profile case in the Netherlands, where there was, biofuel certs issued incorrectly and fraudulently, and that particular case was prosecuted, and the CEO in question has got a sentence of, I believe, between 2 and 3 years. Whereas there were sustainability criteria up to that point under the European regulatory oversight system, there is also now a rethinking on that, and more recently a draft implementing act which includes a lot more stringent measures, and among these are a central database which is being developed by the European Commission, and fuel suppliers will be required to include information about the origin of feedstocks in that database, which will be a much more transparent system. And then we can move to the next slide, Ruben. So for the next steps for the policy in 2022, by March 2022, there will be an order issued to increase the buyout charge, which corresponds to the increased blending rate. Currently the buyout charge, and this is basically that you can buy certificates if you can't blend to the rate required under the obligation. It's currently at 45 cents per litre of biofuels. That will be increased to €1. So that will incentivise blending rather than using the buyout mechanism. We're also, as I mentioned, going to do research on sustainability and availability of biofuels and renewable fuels, given that we are going to have such a steep trajectory of blending in the future. And we will also have a consultation this year on the next iteration of the renewable fuel policy. We plan to do that roughly every 2 years. There's also this year going to be a campaign on the transition, in particular on ethanol in petrol. So that's increasing from E5 to E10. And we'll do that throughout the year before January 2023, when that particular measure would come into effect. As I said, there will be legislation required for all of the measures in the policy statement, and it's something that we're working on this year. And then the next slide, quickly. So I'll just move on to the second item we want to talk about, and that's climate resilience and adaptation. And I know that this group would have had presentations over the years on these topics. I mean, a lot of the governance around adaptation exists, but what's different this year is, or as of last year, is that the actions are now embedded in the Climate Action Plan. So we continue under the legislative framework to have a national adaptation framework from 2018, but that's going to be open for consultation by the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications in 2022. We have our sectoral and local authority adaptation plans, and what was new last year is that we had the Climate Change Advisory Council assessing our progress under those plans and producing scorecards. That was around July last year. So I suppose it's up to all of us to make improvements then with regard to implementation under those plans. And then, as I mentioned, the Climate Action Plan has a number of actions. I've cited there the ones that are relevant to transport, and there would be a few others that might be relevant as well in terms of the wider transport sector. So we can move to the next slide. This is just a little bit of an overview in terms of how the transport sector adaptation delivery was assessed and under the advisory council. This is the way that they break down the assessment. So the first pillar there is risk prioritization and adaptive capacity. The second one is resourcing and mainstreaming, and the third one is governance, coordination and cross-cutting issues. And as you can see, there's a lot of activity going on. I've put in a lot of the various streams of work that are going on there under the first pillar, all the different areas of transport that are involved in adaptation. Under resourcing and mainstreaming, I think we all have resources now deployed to this area. There's capital funding, for example, for local authority adaptation. Irish Rail would receive funding, and regional airports have received some as well in terms of that issue. And then we have, as Caoimhín had mentioned, the NIFTY and the appraisal framework for future investment in transport. And then under the government structures, there are a lot of national, sectoral and adaptation working groups, and the department is pretty much represented in all of them. We have our own critical infrastructure group involving a lot of stakeholders there: CAROS, Department of Housing, OPW, Irish Water, the Department of Environment and Climate Ireland. And we also engage in a lot of collaboration with research bodies to identify and develop adaptation relevant research. It's becoming an increasing part of our work as we move through this process of delivering a climate action plan. So just to the last slide then on this adaptation theme is just setting out what the actions are on the climate action plan. And some of them are fairly familiar. They're a continuation of things that we were doing before. We have our internal working group, which the terms of reference have been revised with a renewed focus on identifying further opportunities. We have a lot of stakeholder engagement going on, as I mentioned, with the research community. We want to expand then in terms of our collaboration with international stakeholders, the OECD and UNECE. And there's a couple of research projects going on as well. One in particular is to define the set of metrics to quantify extreme weather events, in particular revenues loss and cost of repairs. That's something that we're involved in with TII. And then commission research on adaptation to fill any existing knowledge gaps as well. So then the last section I just want to talk about on the next slide is concerning research. So under the Climate Action Plan, we have noted a number of specific research activities we're involved in, and these have been mentioned throughout the presentation. So we have to identify what measures we're going to use to achieve a shortfall of 0.9 megatons of CO2 equivalent, and in particular focusing in on socio-economic impacts of any measures that we use. I've mentioned biofuels and renewable fuels and that study on availability and sustainability. And then we're going to do a third study, which is an assessment to transition away from fossil fuel subsidies in transport, which we've relied on for a number of years. So that's very much in line with what's happening in terms of European regulations in that area. And then just a couple of co-funded research projects that we have on adaptation. We have a comparative study of existing data to create a climate service resource for transport operators. That's something that the EPA are working on. And then another study to identify options and pathways to 2025 concerning climate resilience. So they're slightly longer term studies, but we hope to get some deliverables from those to help inform our policy development and adaptation going forward. And then just finally, that last slide, just a few words on our approach to research. and our own guiding principles. So now it's all about in climate action plans, all about implementation and delivery. So our research is very much quick studies to assess what works, kind of a reflective approach, and that will enable us to be agile and change tack where that needs to happen. We will continue to build the evidence base for decision making as we go along, looking at the longer term trajectory and any opportunities and challenges that present themselves. One of the things we do is, as I said, we have an extensive collaboration going on research, and we'll be building upon that, upon those connections and synergies and developing new networks. And key to the success of our research is obviously stakeholders, a wide range of stakeholders. And the focus here is on building deliberative opportunities where people are actually learning and buying in and building the policy support as we work through the research. And then finally, that approach to co-funded research is something that is very useful to us because we have a small research budget, but when there are other research bodies out there who are much more familiar with carrying out research programs, it's often easier to be involved in those co-funded projects. And the focus obviously is on continuous review to identify any gaps and to focus on priorities for the future. So that's the three areas I wanted to talk about. And the last slide is the usual slide on questions. So we're very happy to take questions. I'm not sure we've left much time, but certainly I think our hosts might come back on screen and we can take some